Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Paul Tang for the S&D.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Madame Lagarde, for being here, but also for bringing back the words by Wim Duisenberg. I love the way you pronounce his name. For bringing back the words that we need, the ECB needs to be open, transparent, and accountable to win the trust of the citizens. And to be open, transparent, and accountable on my side, I just copy and paste the question I put to Mr. De Guindos, and hearing your non-answer that you just gave to my good colleague Henrike Haan, I will try again, 3 times the charm, right? Because profitability of European banks are increasing. And one reason is, and as pointed out by De Grauwe and Yi, the remuneration on bank reserve. Banks earn more on bank reserves, 3.25%, than they do on 10-year German bonds, 2.5%. And the interest payments to European banks from the ECB amount to roughly 1% of national product, a staggering 135 billion euros. De Grauwe and Yi concludes, therefore, that this is, and I quote, an extraordinary act of generosity toward bankers at the expense of taxpayers and the stability of the financial system. And they go on to propose a 2-tier system, including a non-interest-bearing minimum reserve requirement. So my question is, what do you think of their conclusion about generosity? What do you think of their proposal? And third, is this also a discussion at the ECB Governing Council?
So thank you, Mr. Tang, for your question. And let me try to give you an answer which will not be a non-answer, okay? So my answer to your point is, you will regret that, but it's vastly similar to what I said to Mrs. Laluc, but in French. So I'll say it in English to you. And by the way, we did mention Willem Duisenberg extensively on the 25th anniversary. He was the only president who was not with us, as both Mr. Trichet and Mr. Draghi were in attendance. And we did think about him, and I did quote him actually at the end of my remarks, because he was with us, and he certainly was with us from the get-go. So our key purpose, our main objective, our primary mandate, and I've been reminded many times in this room about my primary mandate, and the primary mandate of the ECB is price stability. That's what we should pursue by all means and with all the measures that we can use. The measures that we can use at the moment are the interest rates, and we have deliberately increased interest rates in a very significant manner. The fact that reserves are remunerated at the deposit facility rate is a byproduct of the monetary policy measures that we have to take. So I'm not focusing on margins, on results. The ECB is not even thinking as to whether it is generous or not generous. The ECB is focused on its objective, which is price stability. The question of remuneration, reserve, has not been discussed at this point. Voilà.
Actually,
quickly, Chair, because this.
Sorry, Paul, the second round does not have a follow-up, and
this begs for
the rules apply.
I'm going to just add something, because I understand your frustration, okay? I fully understand your frustration and the perspective that you have. And I think the point made by Vice President De Guindos, maybe it was in response to you, maybe it was in response to somebody else, had to do with excess liquidity which are in the system. What is happening at the moment in a discrete fashion is reduction of the balance sheet of the ECB and reduction of the excess liquidity that is around. How is that happening? Because of the reimbursement of TLTRO that have been taking place, that have withdrawn over 1 trillion euros. Another nearly half trillion euros is due at the end of June. That's another one that is going to reduce the balance sheet of the ECB by as much. And we have started reducing reinvestment and our scheduling. I don't want to prejudge what the decision will be next week by the Governing Council, but there's a very strong likelihood that we will simply stop any reinvestment and let portfolio runoff over the course of time. So all of that is reducing gradually the excess liquidity that is in the system. You will probably think that this is not enough, but we are heading in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just remind that now we finish our round, and then if we have time, we can still catch the eye and take the floor for additional questions. Gilles Boyer, Renew.
Bonjour Madame la Présidente, merci d'être là à nouveau. Si vous m'autorisez, je vais changer un petit peu de sujet, je suis sûr que vous allez m'autoriser. Je voudrais vous interroger sur le projet d'euro numérique. La Banque Centrale Européenne mène une phase d'expérimentation depuis 2 ans. Nous attendons la proposition de la Commission à la fin de ce mois et je sais que la coopération entre les 2 institutions est fructueuse. Ce projet suscite beaucoup d'enthousiasme, mais aussi beaucoup de questions. Mon groupe a de l'ambition sur ce projet. Nous pensons que les pouvoirs publics doivent garder l'initiative en matière monétaire et que si nous ne le faisons pas, d'autres le feront et que nous pourrions le regretter. Alors c'est un projet majeur qui représente un défi technique, bien sûr, mais aussi un défi politique et presque psychologique. Le rapport des Européens à l'argent liquide varie beaucoup selon les États membres, nous le savons. Et pour que ce projet réussisse, les citoyens européens devront se l'approprier, avoir un niveau de confiance élevé envers un moyen de paiement qui devra être un complément de l'argent liquide, une offre supplémentaire, mais en aucun cas s'y substituer. Je crois que ce sera un point essentiel. Et dans une époque de défiance, le défi sera majeur à relever. Alors Fabio Panetta nous a expliqué plusieurs fois la philosophie de la Banque centrale et je l'en remercie à travers vous. Pouvez-vous, s'il vous plaît, nous confirmer que vous avez pris cet aspect politique et psychologique en compte dès la phase d'expérimentation et que c'est un aspect presque passionnel. Et ma deuxième question, comment voyez-vous la coordination entre les institutions sur ce sujet? D'abord entre vous et la Commission pour l'élaboration de la proposition et ensuite la manière dont nous pouvons nous coordonner utilement entre les co-législateurs pour faire aboutir ce beau projet. Merci Madame.
Merci, Monsieur Boyer. Une belle question pour un beau projet. Je ne vais sans doute pas vous répondre en français. So I'll take your question in English because we have been working on this digital euro together with Mr. Panetta and with other members of the Executive Board and all members of the Governing Council in English language. And there are some concepts that for me are just in English language. So one time will come when it's properly translated. I think it will have to be because, as you say, we really believe that this is something that needs the ownership of those who will be using it. I'm, just like you, convinced that we have to head in that direction because we want to remain sovereign, and sovereignty is also demonstrated by the currency that we use. And none of us would like to see another currency suddenly become the attribute of the sovereignty over Europe by somebody else than the Europeans. So, have we taken into account 2 things that you've mentioned? First of all, the sensitivity that varies between member states and between compatriots of those member states to cash? Yes, is the answer. And it's absolutely firm that the digital euro is not to be a substitute to cash and will coexist with cash for those who want to use one or those who want to use the other or those who want to use both. We know that in some countries, the use of cash has dwindled very much. In other countries, it is still going strongly, and that need not change because of the introduction of the digital euro. So to your first question, irrevocably, emphatically, yes, the project is sensitive and attentive to the various sort of psychological approach to cash and sensitivity of people to cash. Your second question was of a more sort of psychological response and reaction to digital means of payment. And I think here we have learned a lot from some of the surveys and some of the forum that we opened and to which contributed a lot of Europeans. And what we received in terms of feedback in particular, which will not come as a surprise to you because I'm sure you see that on a regular basis, is the particular sensitivity to privacy. And the fact that users, those people who cared to answer the surveys, understood that it could not be anonymous, entirely anonymous like cash, because of anti-money laundering, because of countering the financing of terrorism. That requires that banks are intermediaries that will be marketing and using digital euro with their customers, are accountable for those controls. But what we heard loud and clear is that Europeans were very attentive to their privacy and certainly do not want to see their data, the use that they make of digital euro being either monetized or exploited in any shape or form. So I think that the structure that is currently considered is intended to be as protective as possible of the privacy of people. And in particular, the fact that the digital euro cannot be programmable is an important factor to make sure that that privacy is protected. I think on your last question, you asked us what was the relationship between the various institutions. You know, we can only do what we can do, and we don't want to step out of our territory or assume that we know better. There is a role for us to understand how this payment mean can be organized, orchestrated, how the bolts and knots of this can function with financial stability associated to it. But then the whole project requires that the legislator, that is you, be proposed a draft that I think the Commission is expected to release, I hope, before the end of June. That's what we are told as well. And from there on, it's going to be work that will bring, I'm sure, the three key institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, the Council, together to make sure that all factors are taken into account. Our job is to make sure that it can work, that it's going to be conducive to financial stability, protecting of our monetary sovereignty, but the legal framework within which that will work out will be your call at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Enrique Hahn for the Greens.
Thanks again. In the last Governing Council meeting of May 4th, the ECB decided to discontinue reinvestments of its asset purchase program from July onwards. And this means that the green tilting of its corporate sector purchase program will come to a premature end. And addressing this issue, Executive Board member Schnabel said in a January speech that the ECB needs to consider actively reshuffling the portfolio towards greener issues. So therefore, I would like to know, is the ECB considering actively selling carbon-intensive bonds and purchasing green ones to continue fulfilling both its primary mandate of price stability and its secondary mandate by indirectly supporting the EU's environmental objectives? Thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Hahn. And you know, your question actually reminds me of how much progress we have made since, you know, some of the few first sessions where I had this dialogue with you, and when I tried to explain what our strategy would be, and when I tried to convince some of my Governing Council members that yes, of course, climate change was something that we had to factor into our monetary policy, our risk management, and our portfolio management, and including portfolio for monetary policy purposes. So, huge progress. One of the key, I would say, key milestones of progress was, since last October, the tilting that we used in relation to the monetary policy portfolio. Then we moved on in February and increased the tilting rate that we applied, which led to a significant decarbonization of our monetary policy portfolio. And that was done through the reinvestments. So whenever redemption came about and we reinvested taking into account disclosure, footprint, and transition plan in order to assess how the risk was actually considered by the institution of which we were purchasing the bonds. Now, of course, if and when we stop complete reinvestment, and if we let runoff take place, this tilting will not operate anymore. And I think Mrs. Stamble was right to say that we will then have to consider how we can actually continue to implement those climate change strategy that was adopted in order to be Paris Agreement compliant in the situation of runoff. We have not yet made decision. These are measures that are under review, and that, of course, I will report back to you when they are decided. But they are on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to René Repasi for SND.
Thank you so much. Now, I was triggered by your introductory remarks that also repeated the monetary policy statement of 4 May, when there was a reference made to profits. When you had the reference that in some sectors you were able to see that profit margins were increased due to the mismatch between supply and demand, as you mentioned it, and your colleague in the Governing Council, Isabel Schnabel, last year said, on average, profits have recently been a key contributor to total domestic inflation above the historical contribution, which I find indeed a very interesting statement. Interesting in a sense that basically by monetary policy tools you cannot do much about price increases, in particular if they relate to market power. And seeing what we know from competition law, we have increases in prices if there is cooperation, some sort of cartel behavior behind even leading companies raising prices on markets. Therefore, I would like to dive a bit deeper on which evidence you base your conclusion on the influence of profits on inflation. And second, from an ECB perspective, which tools the European Commission as the other difficulty accountable institution when it comes to competition law to the European Parliament should actually have in order to tackle this, since competition law procedures take ages until they actually have any effect, whilst here we need to have quick action. So, yeah, I would be curious on your statement.
I'm not sure exactly what your question is, but I'm happy to comment on the respective contributions of profit on the one hand, wages on the other hand, to inflation, because that has been the debate, and the issue that has been underlined by both Philip Lane in the first place, Isabel Schnabel as well, was the contribution of profit to inflation, which had gone a little bit missing for a very simple reason, which has to do with the fact that we don't have as much and as good data on profit as we do on wages. I think that, if I had the choice, I would like to improve our data on profit on an aggregate basis, as well as on a more granular basis, to really fully understand and appreciate the transmission of the cost push that was suffered by many corporate sectors into final prices. And I would also like to improve the data that we have on wages as well, because it's generally very much looking backward, and we are building indicators to try to understand exactly where collective agreement and where negotiations are leading for the future. But it's not as good as it should be to perfectly inform us about the respective contributions of both. But as I said, I think to Mrs. Laluc earlier on, maybe it was somebody else, I can't remember now. We have observed late in 22 and certainly early in 23 that over the course of the year 2022, certain sectors in particular of the economy had taken advantage of, as you said, the mismatch between supply, constrained by bottlenecks, and demand, enhanced by recovery, and a situation of everybody is in the same position, we're all going to increase prices, which can be concerted practice, which can be just market-driven practices. And in those circumstances, those sectors have taken advantage to push cost through entirely without squeezing on margins, and for some of them to push prices higher than just the cost push that would have resulted from the imported inflation. I mentioned a few sectors that are well known, which have been mentioned in the March speech by Philip Lane. It's agriculture, it's construction, some services activities, and I think that it's important that competition authorities could actually look at those behaviors. And I would certainly regard that as perfectly called for in order to fully understand and appreciate the legitimacy of some practices or the concerted practices, if they apply. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Eugene Urzika for ECR.
Thank you very much. Madame Lagarde, the central bank and the governments can both affect inflation. If governments have smaller fiscal deficit and public debts, there will be less new money in the economy, which can help lower inflation. I wonder if the central bank knows how much the government or governments need to save to keep inflation below 2% a year. I also want to ask you, what do you think about the new Commission's proposal to change the rules for government spending? I think the plan is too vague and does not have clear numbers that the governments have to follow. Do you think the plan is strong enough to deal with inflation from the government side or the Commission side? And in footnote, I would like to inform you that I use an artificial intelligence tool, the one which is not prohibited by the creators to be used in politics, to help me formulate these questions. I would like to understand the reaction of public to the use of artificial intelligence by politicians. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Urzika. Pronounced properly, Urzika. Yeah, for your question, and I can assure you that my response is not driven, built, or assisted by artificial intelligence, be it a legitimate or illegitimate device or tool. Your question is focused on the fiscal governance proposals that emanate from the Commission and on which the European Central Bank will give its opinion as is required. The position was fairly recently published, but we certainly, first of all, welcome the fact that this proposal is on the table, because we hope that the time will be sufficient before the end of 2023 for a new framework to be agreed between the parties so that member states can operate and decide their public finance management and their fiscal operations within a new framework. We welcome certain elements of this fiscal governance proposal. In particular, we welcome that there would be more national ownership. That is good. We also appreciate that there is a stronger focus on high debt levels and a medium-term perspective. We agree, and we had said initially that stronger enforcement measures would be necessary and an essential part. And we certainly look forward to constructive solutions to still open issues. So we will be as good a partner as we can if our views are sought, and we will give our opinion on those proposals. We understand, and we have actually discussed those objectives, but the fact that one of the objectives is a realistic, gradual and sustained adjustment of public debt seems to be a good objective. Second, reducing debt heterogeneity between member states within Europe is also the right objective in our view. Incentivizing growth and investment, right objective, and enhancing counter-cyclicality is also a good objective. So those are the key parameters and the key considerations that we have had when we heard the evolution of this fiscal governance proposal. We hope that progress will be made. We know that it's controversial. There are a few member states that are not exactly on the same page as the proposal by the Commission, but we really, really hope that something is reached in terms of agreement before the end of the fiscal year 23, so that in 24, member states, when they prepare their budget, know exactly within what framework they operate. We cannot continue to function in limbo if that was not the case. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. This is actually the same view that we have as a parliament that we have expressed many times. So we are ready to work on it. We are just waiting for the translation so we can formally start, but we have already informally started to work on it and we hope to be able to push it as and finalize within the end of this legislature. So